Thanks, Sarah, and good evening, and thank you all for coming. Mike said he'll calm us down with his talk, so I'll do the opposite. I'll start with some drama if my slides come up. I'll start with a story that happened on August 1st in 2012. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is the crazy breakdown of Knight Capital, very large, well-respected Wall Street firm, and my countdown is not working. But that's fine. Yes. It's a very large, a large, well-respected trading firm on Wall Street, and it was actually one of the largest traders by volume on the street at the time. And because of a small computer glitch, and that combined with a very kind of ordinary, boring human mistake, one of the tech guys forgot to roll out a software update on all the servers of the firm. They lost about $500 million in just half an hour. And that was this really kind of shocking mistake in that, well, it was a lot of money, I mean, even for Wall Street. It happened very quickly, but it was even more shocking because the causes were so small. It was this sort of stupid, silly, mundane mistakes. It wasn't, that somebody was trying to steal their money. It didn't go on for a long time. There wasn't some kind of big mistake. It was this small little thing. If you are reading the news today, or if you've been reading them in the last few hours, you've seen what's happening with airplanes and air traffic in Europe. About half of airplanes, commercial planes, are delayed in Europe because of a computer glitch today, about 15,000 flights. And people are saying, oh, this has never happened again, but it actually has. It has happened at least at the level of airlines. And in some ways very similar to that Knight Capital failure in that it didn't come from a terrorist attack. There was nothing wrong with the airplanes. There was nothing wrong with the pilots. It's just a small computer glitch in a reservation system or in the air traffic control system, or as in this case, a couple of years ago with British Airways, a guy unplugging the power cord at the wrong time in the wrong place, and that ended up grounding 75,000 people, some of them for days. So again, it's this same idea of a small error leading to something much bigger. This is one of my kind of favorite cases. It's just so crazy. In Washington State, because again of a computer glitch, the state prison system let out about 3,200 people out of prison, some of them violent felons. This went on for about 12 years. When we interviewed the chief information officer about this and we asked him, so how did that feel, that moment when you realized that you've been letting these people out for 12 years? And he said, well, the technical term is it's an oh shit moment. And it really was, because if you think about it, if one felon escapes, we pull out all the stops to find them and stop them. And here the system was just letting them out day after day after day, often a month or 2 or 3 months early. And then some of them actually ended up committing serious violent crimes, including murder in one case, which of course led to a huge lawsuit against the state. And again, it was this sort of small failure leading to something much bigger. Or think about Hawaii just a few weeks earlier, right? One guy pressing the wrong button one time, and all of a sudden, the whole state, and in fact the whole country, the whole world, for a few minutes is in panic. And so if you look at these failures, I think you start seeing this pattern where we don't get these sort of big external shocks causing big meltdowns. Instead, what we get is these small little things that snowball into something much, much bigger. And it turns out that in the 1970s, 1980s, people actually started to study these kind of failures. A sociologist named Charles Perrault spent quite a lot of time looking at these, and he sort of came up with this formula that, in a sense, is a formula for understanding or finding the systems that are most vulnerable to these kinds of failures, the failures that sort of come from small errors, surprise us, and then snowball into something much bigger in uncontrollable ways. And Perrault said that what sets us up for those kinds of failures is really two things. One is what he calls complexity. The other is tight coupling. By complexity, he means that our system is more like an elaborate web and less like a a linear process, and it's also something that's hard to peek into. We can't just sort of directly look into it. We have to rely on an indirect indicator. Tight coupling, it's this fancy engineering term, but it really just means that there's not a lot of slack in the system. The system is not very forgiving. Once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back, you can't call a timeout. The system runs away with you very, very quickly once problems start to come up. And he says that when you have both of these elements, you are in this kind of danger zone where small errors can grow into something much bigger. And that's because complexity tends to confuse us. And then tight coupling means that we don't really have the time and the resources and the buffer to control these emerging problems. So we often end up misdiagnosing what's going on, or it takes us 6 months of investigating what really happened to figure something out rather than doing it in 6 minutes or 6 seconds. But the system is failing at a much faster rate than our own comprehension of it. Now, I think what's really interesting is that when Perrault looked at this in the 1980s, the systems that fell into that danger zone and had both complexity and tight coupling were these kind of large, complex, and sort of exotic industrial systems. Chemical plants, nuclear plants, military warning systems, space shuttles, and things like that. So not our ordinary, normal business systems. But if you look at our systems today, a lot of the systems that we run as a business, or a lot of the systems that we use as customers, kind of fit this criteria of both complexity and tight coupling. If you think about finance, so what happened with Knight Capital, think about our hospitals and how they are run, our transportation systems, ever more connected, ever more tightly coupled, or even our homes. As we are inviting these smart technologies into our homes, they gave us all these benefits, but they also introduced a tremendous amount of complexity, and in some cases they are so tightly coupled that sort of when one piece of that ecosystem fails, then everything else fails with it. I'm thinking about, there was a couple of months ago, these reports about people's smart thermostats turning on and turning their homes into sweat lodges, and then just a month later, the opposite happening, all these things turning off, and then babies getting really cold in their rooms. In other cases, the whole system failing, so people can't get out of their homes. So it's the same kind of story, but we used to see this in nuclear power plants. Now we are starting to see that in finance and ordinary business operations, and even in our cars and our homes. So what can we do about this? And I mean, of course, the book we have collectively written, a lot of it is actually about solutions. So I won't go too deep into that. I just want to give you a couple of small tidbits. And I think one interesting way to do that is think about one industry that actually has done pretty well in becoming safer while they have become both more complex and tightly coupled. And that's commercial aviation, at least commercial aviation in North America. The system has become enormously more complex. It's a very unforgiving system. Now we have about 110,000 flights a day, every single day, in this very elaborate system. And yet, over time, flying has become much safer. Now apparently it's safer than walking, certainly than walking in Toronto. So what did aviation do? So they've done a lot of things, and usually with these kinds of complex problems, there isn't one or two things that you can do. But I just want to mention 4 things briefly that have really helped them. One is that they realized that they have to teach people, they have to teach pilots the language of dissent. They have to tell people or train people how they can speak up and how they can listen to one another. And this used to be, we used to think that the ability to speak up and the ability to listen to people is sort of culturally hardwired, or maybe it's hardwired in our personalities. But what the aviation experience shows is that it's actually something that you can teach people. And that can be really powerful in a complex system, because one of the hallmarks of any complex system is that nobody can foresee all the problems before we start running the system. But once things start to emerge, there's usually somebody on the ground, your co-pilot, a baggage handler, somebody in your organization who starts seeing the cracks on the wall or the writing on the wall. But if they don't tell you or if you don't listen, then you're losing all this great data. And it turns out there's a way to teach people to do this. The second great thing they do, and they're still figuring this out, but they have become pretty good at it, is to learn from near misses, learn from small failures, not wait for the big crashes, but learn from things where a crash almost happened. And what they do is they collect an enormous amount of data on things that almost went wrong. If you're a pilot, you get to report things, you get immunity from prosecution and regulatory action in exchange. So there's an incentive for people to report. And then the industry as a whole gets together and actually uses a third party, a unit at NASA, which looks at this data and tries to teach some lessons to the entire industry. Third, aviation has done a great job of resisting this very understandable and very kind of human urge and temptation to add more safety features when something breaks. So when something breaks, usually our temptation is just to, okay, let's add one small little technological fix or a warning system or an alert so that thing doesn't happen again. Or if it happens again, we'll be warned about it. And aviation used to do that in the 70s and 80s, but it just didn't work. It's just pilots were completely overwhelmed by alarms, and they just didn't know how to react in an emergency situation. And now they take a very kind of ruthless approach to alerts and warning systems in general. You'd be quite surprised to know that if you're taking a plane and an engine is on fire, that doesn't even, not even that triggers the highest level of alerts. It really has to be something more serious than that. That only triggers the secondary level. Because they realize that, too many alerts overwhelm people during emergencies, but also too many alerts mean that people just turn off. There is a lot of alarm fatigue. And finally, and I think this is a principle we actually see in a lot of other fields as well, whether you are thinking about car design or even accounting systems, is aviation also has been trying to resist the temptation to privilege elegant designs over robust designs. So sometimes they go for some solutions that are really ugly. If you look at these controllers just above me on that Boeing 737, there are these large control columns. And they're really ugly, and the pilots sort of hate them because they make them spill their lunch on their shirts. And if you compare that to that Airbus, that's much more sleek. It's very French. You can even have your lunch there. You can pull out. There is a space to pull out a tray table and have your lunch over there. It's much more elegant. It's much more beautiful. But it turns out that those little side sticks now have played a pretty big role in a number of accidents, because when a crisis emerged, it was very hard for the pilots to see what the other pilot was doing. And that would never happen with these giant control columns behind me. It's just, those are literally in your face. And that's sort of counterintuitive, but there's some beauty to these ugly designs. And in closing, I think one takeaway, and I think I see this in some of my colleagues' writing as well in this book, is that if you look at the solutions, some of the solutions we talk about, many of them are not really rocket science. I mean, some of them are counterintuitive, but a lot of them seem sort of obvious once you think about it. But that doesn't mean that they are easy to implement. And I think that's something that we see very often, is that these solutions seem simple, but they are not easy because they sort of go against our natural instinct, and we don't want to implement them. The good news is that with aviation, their lessons have been written in blood, and ours in ordinary business don't need to be. We can just steal their lessons for our own purposes. So, thank you.